The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of Buckingham Palace as tourists began gathering for the daily changing of the guard ceremony. Among the crowd stood Margaret Thornfield, a wealthy businesswoman from New York who had made her fortune in real estate. Her designer handbag hung from her arm, and her perfectly styled blonde hair caught the London breeze as she pushed through the growing crowd with little regard for others around her. Margaret had always believed that money could buy anything, including respect and special treatment. She had flown first class to London specifically to see the royal ceremony, but her expectations went far beyond simply watching from the designated tourist areas. She wanted the perfect photograph, the kind that would make her friends back home jealous when she posted it on social media. Standing behind the rope barriers with hundreds of other visitors was not what she had in mind. Margaret noticed the tall, imposing figure of Guard James Fletcher, a 28-year-old soldier who had served his country with distinction for over 8 years. He stood perfectly still in his iconic red tunic and tall black bearskin hat, his rifle held at attention as he maintained his post near the palace gates. The morning had started like any other for James. He had risen at dawn, polished his uniform to perfection, and taken his position as thousands of visitors began arriving. He had learned long ago to remain focused, despite the constant chatter, camera flashes, and occasional attempts by tourists to get his attention. His training had taught him discipline, patience, and the importance of maintaining dignity, even in challenging situations. Margaret studied the guard for several minutes, plotting her approach. She had read online that the guards were not supposed to move or react to tourists, which she saw as an opportunity rather than a rule to respect. She wanted a close-up photo with the guard, something that would set her apart from the typical tourist snapshots. Ignoring the clearly marked barriers and the disapproving looks from other tourists, Margaret ducked under the rope and began walking confidently toward James's position. A security officer noticed her breach and started moving in her direction, but Margaret quickened her pace, determined to reach the guard before anyone could stop her. "Excuse me," she called out loudly as she approached James, her voice carrying an air of entitlement that made nearby tourists turn their heads. "I need you to pose for a picture with me. I've come all the way from New York, and I'm not leaving without the perfect shot." James remained perfectly still, his eyes fixed straight ahead as his training dictated. His breathing was steady, and his posture unchanged, despite the woman now standing directly in front of him. Years of discipline had prepared him for exactly these types of situations, though few tourists had ever been quite so bold in their approach. Margaret pulled out her expensive phone and held it up, expecting the guard to at least acknowledge her presence. When he didn't react, her frustration began to build. She was accustomed to getting her way, especially when dealing with people she considered to be in service positions. "Hello, I'm talking to you," she said, her voice growing louder and more demanding. "Look, I don't have all day. Just turn your head and smile for 1 second. It's not that difficult." The crowd around them had begun to notice the commotion. Some tourists pulled out their own cameras, sensing that something interesting was about to unfold. Others whispered among themselves, shocked by the woman's boldness and lack of respect for the ceremonial nature of the guard's duties. A middle-aged man from Scotland tried to intervene politely. "Excuse me, miss, but you're not supposed to be over there. The guards can't break their positions during the ceremony." Margaret turned toward him with a sharp look. "Mind your own business. I know what I'm doing." She then returned her attention to James, stepping even closer to his position. "Listen, soldier boy," she said, using a tone that dripped with condescension. "I've paid good money to be here, and I deserve better service than this. In America, customer service actually means something. Now, are you going to cooperate, or do I need to speak to your supervisor?" James continued to maintain his position, though those observing closely might have noticed the slightest tightening around his eyes. He had dealt with difficult tourists before, but the woman's entitled attitude and disrespectful language were testing even his well-trained patience. Margaret's frustration reached a boiling point when she realized that her demands were having no effect. She had never encountered someone who wouldn't bend to her will, especially someone she viewed as being in a service position. Her face flushed red as she prepared to escalate the situation further. "You know what? Fine. If you won't cooperate willingly, then I'll just have to make you," she declared, reaching out toward James's uniform as if to grab his arm or adjust his position herself. The crowd gasped collectively as they watched the woman's hand move toward the guard. Security officers were now hurrying toward the scene, but they were still several yards away. The tension in the air was palpable as everyone waited to see what would happen next. James felt the woman's fingers brush against his sleeve, a clear violation of protocol and personal space that could not be ignored. For the first time since taking his position that morning, he had a decision to make about how to respond to a situation that had clearly moved beyond the realm of typical tourist behavior. The morning ceremony that had started so peacefully was about to become a moment that none of the hundreds of witnesses would ever forget. Margaret's sense of entitlement had led her into a confrontation with one of Britain's most disciplined and respected soldiers, and the outcome would soon demonstrate the stark difference between true authority and mere arrogance. The moment Margaret's hand made contact with James's uniform, something shifted in the atmosphere around Buckingham Palace. The crowd held its breath as they watched the guard's response unfold with precise, controlled movements that spoke of years of military training and unwavering discipline. James slowly turned his head to look directly at Margaret, his movement deliberate and commanding. His steel-blue eyes met hers with an intensity that immediately made her step backward. There was no anger in his gaze, no loss of composure, but rather a quiet authority that seemed to fill the space between them. "Madam," he said in a clear, measured voice that carried across the courtyard, "you will step back behind the designated barrier immediately." The power in his voice was unmistakable, yet he had not raised it or shown any sign of aggression. Margaret found herself frozen for a moment, suddenly aware that she had crossed a line with someone who possessed a type of authority she had never encountered in her world of business deals and corporate boardrooms. "You can't tell me what to do," she stammered, though her earlier confidence had clearly been shaken. "I have rights as a tourist. I've paid good money to be here, and I demand respect." James took one measured step forward, his movements precise and controlled. The crowd around them grew larger as word spread through the tourist area that something extraordinary was happening. Phone cameras appeared from every direction, capturing what was becoming an unprecedented interaction with one of Britain's royal guards. "Your rights as a tourist do not include disrespecting the crown, interfering with ceremonial duties, or making physical contact with Her Majesty's Guard," James replied, his voice remaining calm, but carrying an unmistakable edge of steel. "You have violated protocol, and you will comply with my instructions." Margaret felt a flush of embarrassment as she realized that hundreds of people were now watching the exchange, many recording it on their phones. She had come to London expecting to be the center of attention for all the right reasons, but now she was becoming famous for entirely different circumstances. An elderly British gentleman in the crowd called out, "Good on you, soldier! Show her some proper respect for the Queen." His comment was met with murmurs of agreement from other tourists who had been watching Margaret's behavior with growing disgust. The security officers finally reached the scene, but they held back, recognizing that James had the situation under control. They had worked with the royal guards for years and knew that these soldiers were more than capable of handling difficult situations with appropriate authority and restraint. Margaret's face grew redder as she realized that the crowd was not on her side. In her business world, she was accustomed to having people defer to her wealth and status, but here she was facing someone whose authority came from duty, honor, and service to something greater than personal gain. "You don't understand who I am," she said, her voice becoming shrill. "I own 3 companies back in New York. I employ hundreds of people. I'm not some ordinary tourist you can just dismiss." James remained unmoved by her claims of importance. "Your business accomplishments are irrelevant here, madam. What matters is your behavior in the presence of a royal guard and your respect for British traditions. Both have been found lacking." A young girl in the crowd tugged on her father's sleeve and whispered loudly, "Daddy, why is that lady being so mean to the soldier?" Her innocent question seemed to capture what many in the crowd were thinking, and Margaret felt the weight of their collective disapproval. James continued, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "You have disrupted a centuries-old ceremony, disrespected the uniform I wear in service to my country, and shown contempt for traditions that millions of people around the world come to witness with proper reverence." Margaret opened her mouth to argue, but something in James's steady gaze made her hesitate. For the first time in many years, she was facing someone who could not be bought, intimidated, or manipulated. His authority came from something deeper than money or social status. "I suggest," James continued, "that you use this moment to reflect on the difference between demanding respect and earning it. Respect is not something you can purchase with your wealth or command through your business position. It must be earned through your actions and behavior toward others." The crowd around them had grown silent, captivated by the guard's calm but powerful response. Many of the tourists had come to London expecting to see pageantry and tradition, but they were witnessing something more profound, a lesson in dignity, respect, and the quiet strength that comes from true authority. Margaret looked around at the faces surrounding her, seeing disapproval and disappointment instead of the admiration she had sought. Children were staring at her with confusion, elderly couples were shaking their heads, and fellow Americans in the crowd looked embarrassed by her behavior. A woman from Texas called out, "We're not all like that, officer. Some of us know how to show proper respect." Her comment drew nods and verbal agreement from other American tourists who were mortified by Margaret's representation of their country. James acknowledged the supportive crowd with a slight nod before returning his attention to Margaret. "You have a choice to make now, madam. You can continue with this display of entitlement, or you can demonstrate that you are capable of learning from this experience. The decision is yours, but it will be made immediately." The weight of his words, combined with the obvious disapproval of the crowd, finally began to penetrate Margaret's armor of arrogance. She had built her life around controlling situations and people, but she was discovering that some things could not be controlled through wealth or demands. Security officers stood ready to escort her away if necessary, but James's handling of the situation had transformed it from a simple security issue into something more meaningful. The crowd waited to see how Margaret would respond to this lesson in humility and respect. Margaret stood in the center of the crowd, feeling smaller than she had ever felt in her adult life. The hundreds of eyes watching her, the cameras recording her humiliation, and most importantly, the steady, patient gaze of Guard James Fletcher had stripped away all her usual defenses. For the first time in decades, she was forced to confront the reality of her own behavior. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity. Margaret's mouth opened and closed several times as she struggled to find words. Throughout her successful business career, she had always been able to talk her way out of difficult situations. But standing before this young soldier, she found herself speechless. James waited patiently, his posture still perfect, his expression calm but alert. He had not moved from his position, had not raised his voice, and had not shown any sign of losing his composure. His quiet strength and unwavering dignity stood in stark contrast to Margaret's earlier outburst of entitlement and rudeness. Finally, Margaret's shoulders sagged slightly, and she took a small step backward. She began, then stopped, looking down at the ground. The realization of how poorly she had behaved was beginning to sink in, and with it came a feeling she rarely experienced: genuine shame. "I apologize," she said quietly, her voice barely audible to those standing closest to her. The crowd leaned in slightly, straining to hear what the woman who had been so loud and demanding just moments before was now saying. James maintained his professional demeanor but nodded slightly, encouraging her to continue. His training had taught him that true discipline sometimes meant showing mercy and allowing others the opportunity to redeem themselves. "I apologize," Margaret repeated, this time louder and clearer. "I was wrong to touch you, to demand things of you, and to disrespect your duty." She looked up at James, meeting his eyes for the first time with something resembling humility. "You're absolutely right. I don't deserve respect just because of my money or my business success. I should have shown respect for you and for this ceremony from the beginning." The crowd's murmur of surprise rippled through the courtyard. Many had expected the confrontation to end with security forcibly removing the difficult tourist, but instead they were witnessing something unexpected: a genuine moment of accountability and growth. James stepped back into his ceremonial position, but continued to address Margaret with the same calm authority. "Thank you for that acknowledgement, madam. True strength is shown not in demanding what we think we deserve, but in recognizing when we have been wrong and taking steps to correct our behavior." An elderly British woman in the crowd smiled and nodded approvingly. "That's a proper apology, love," she called out gently. "We all make mistakes, but not everyone has the courage to admit them." Margaret felt tears beginning to form in her eyes, as the woman's kindness hit her harder than any criticism could have. She realized that her entire approach to interacting with people had been fundamentally flawed. She had spent so many years using her wealth and position to control situations that she had forgotten how to simply treat people with basic human decency. "I want to thank you," Margaret said, addressing James directly. "You could have had security drag me away, or you could have humiliated me in front of all these people. Instead, you gave me a chance to understand my mistake and do better. That took more strength and character than I've shown in years." James maintained his professional demeanor, but allowed a slight warmth to enter his voice. "Service to others, whether to one's country or simply to one's fellow human beings, requires us to respond to difficult situations with wisdom rather than anger. Sometimes the most powerful response is patience and the opportunity for learning." The crowd began to applaud, slowly at first, then building to enthusiastic approval. They were applauding not just James's handling of the situation, but Margaret's willingness to acknowledge her mistakes and change her behavior. The American tourists in the crowd seemed especially relieved and proud that their fellow countrywoman had found the grace to apologize properly. Margaret turned to address the crowd that had witnessed her transformation. "I also owe all of you an apology. You came here to witness something beautiful and historic, and instead you had to watch me behave like a spoiled child. I'm embarrassed by my actions, and I promise to do better." A young father holding his daughter called out, "That's what real courage looks like, sweetheart," he said to his child. "Being brave enough to admit when you're wrong and apologize." As Margaret finally stepped back behind the barrier where she should have remained all along, she found that other tourists made room for her with understanding smiles rather than the hostile looks she had been receiving earlier. A Canadian couple even offered to take a proper photo of her with the palace in the background, respecting the appropriate boundaries. James returned to his ceremonial duties, but the impact of the encounter continued to resonate throughout the crowd. Tourists began talking quietly among themselves about what they had witnessed, sharing their own stories of times when they had learned important lessons about humility and respect. Margaret spent the remainder of the ceremony watching James with newfound admiration. She observed how he maintained his dignity and composure despite the constant attention of hundreds of tourists, how he embodied service and duty without needing recognition or praise. She began to understand that true authority came not from demanding compliance, but from earning respect through consistent character and behavior. When the ceremony concluded, Margaret approached the barrier one final time, maintaining proper distance and respect. "Guard Fletcher," she called softly. James acknowledged her with a professional nod. "Thank you for teaching me something I should have learned long ago," she said. "I'll remember this lesson for the rest of my life." As Margaret walked away from Buckingham Palace that day, she carried with her more than just photos and souvenirs. She carried a new understanding of what it meant to treat others with respect, regardless of their position in life. The encounter with Guard James Fletcher had become a turning point that would influence how she conducted herself in business and in life for years to come. The story of the arrogant American woman and the composed British Guard spread quickly through social media, but it became known not as a tale of confrontation, but as an inspiring example of how patience, dignity, and quiet strength could transform even the most difficult situations into opportunities for growth and understanding. James Fletcher had demonstrated that true power lies not in the ability to dominate others, but in the wisdom to guide them toward better versions of themselves.